And welcome back to Bengal Bites, a podcast about the Cincinnati Bengals from one fan's real, honest perspective. I'm your host, Derek, and this is episode 83. In this episode, we're going to be talking about everything that happened since the Cincinnati Bengals' last regular season game. The NFL playoffs have come and gone. We've got Super Bowl champion Philadelphia Eagles. So there's lots to summarize and recap from all that stuff, but also Bengals made a lot of changes to their coaching staff. Defensive coordinator Lou Anarumo and a lot of his assistants are gone. Frank Pollock, offensive line coach, is gone. Bengals have hired a new defensive coordinator and a bunch of assistant coaches. And around the NFL, we saw a lot of teams hiring new head coaches. 6 or 7 teams that hired their new coaches, so we'll talk about that. And there was also some news from a player perspective in terms of, even though the Bengals didn't make it to the Super Bowl, they have Super Bowl media week where all these players are going up and down giving interviews. So we saw a lot of Bengals players giving interviews and saying all the right things about wanting to bring back their teammates and being fair about it and all that stuff. So people like Joe Burrow, T. Higgins, Jamar Chase, Trey Hendrickson, and more were quoted. And there's some interesting quotes to talk about. But also, Duke Tobin was at the Senior Bowl, and he gave some interesting quotes that can be summarized as "we'll see," but we'll get into more of that. We also had a couple of interesting, somewhat negative stories from 2 players on the Bengals named Jermaine, who are both looking to leave or be evicted in either case, but we'll talk about that. And then we'll talk about some listener feedback that we got on some episodes previously. I love listener feedback, so if you have anything to make the show better, let me know, and I'll take a moment to discuss that and more about why I make this show. But if you're brand new to this show, you can go back and listen to really any of the episodes. Episode 0 was the first one where I really just broke it down and told you why I'm making this show. But as a lifelong fan of the Bengals and a former player of football, I have so much time that I spend, for whatever reason, thinking about the Bengals. Kind of like Joe Goodberry's Bengals on the Brain show. I feel like it's kind of like I get a song stuck in my head for days. Sometimes I'll just have the Bengals stuck in my head for days. I can't get them out of there. No matter how much I wish I could think about something else, I'll be thinking about the Bengals, and I need some outlet for that. And this podcast is one way to do it. But I don't want to make this show just about me and what I want to say about the Bengals. I want to think about what the listener wants to hear about the Bengals. And I listen to lots of Bengals podcasts. Sometimes I get sick of them because a lot of them sound the same. A lot of them are just really repeating whatever the Bengals coaches and whatever the Bengals media department puts out there. So I try to have my own independent thoughts about what I think. I don't want to be overly cynical. I promise I try to think of all the positives I can. But sometimes after a season like the one that we just experienced, there's only so much positivity that can exist inside of me. And eventually I get a little frustrated. So I had to let some of that frustration out. I apologize on some of the last episodes. It was getting too negative. I just couldn't take it anymore. But let's get into this episode. So Bengals, as we know, got rid of Lou Anarumo, defensive coordinator. The defense was kind of the weakest point of the Bengals. That's what cost them a lot of the games. Even when they were scoring like 30 and 40-something points, they still managed to lose because they allowed more points on defense. So Lou Anarumo is out. But interestingly, Lou Anarumo got rehired as defensive coordinator by the Indianapolis Colts before the Bengals hired his replacement. So that's got to feel kind of vindicating for Lou Anarumo to think, okay, well, you're going to let me go. I'll get a new job before you even hire my replacement. So good luck to Lou Anarumo and the Colts defense. We also saw Frank Pollock, offensive line coach, go. And that was interesting because, end of the season, they had Cody Ford playing all up and down the line, playing almost every position except for center. And so on the one hand, you could say Frank Pollock did a good job of getting Cody Ford playable and not looking completely overmatched at the end of the season. But on the other hand, Cordell Volson hasn't really materialized into that great of a player. Marius Mims has been up and down. I know a lot of people want to see glass half full with Marius Mims, and the book is still to be written. I know he had some good matchups against top players like Myles Garrett and TJ Watt, so there's something there with Marius Mims, but also he's had some injuries already in his career. He had a pec injury in preseason, and then he had like a broken thumb or something at the end of the season, some ankle injury history with Marius, so we'll have to keep an eye on that. He's still a work in progress. Alex Kappa didn't have his best season. Orlando Brown was looking pretty good, actually, until he got injured halfway through the season. So I wouldn't say the offensive line performance was all on Frank Pollock. Certainly the younger guys, like the backups, never really developed into much of anything. But as a recurring theme, whose fault is it that these players didn't develop? Was it the coach, or was it the people who picked them in the first place? So same thing with Marion Hobby, defensive line coach. I know Miles Murphy, the first round pick from last season, or 2 drafts ago, he didn't have a sack, and I know sacks are kind of an overrated stat, but Miles Murphy didn't really, wasn't making much of a play in the run game or the pass game, so underwhelming performance. And then the rookies, Chris Jenkins and McKinley Jackson for the Bengals, they had a few moments here and there, but not exactly, a lot of performances that we would really get excited about for second and third round picks out of the draft last year. Chris Jenkins Jr., he still continues to look small on tape, and that was the big knock on him coming out of the draft. A little bit undersized, and he kind of looks that way when he's playing out on the field. So again, is that Marion Hobby's fault that Chris Jenkins is kind of undersized and they're not getting a lot out of him? I don't know. James Betcher, linebackers coach. Linebackers were not playing very well, and so he was kind of one of these guys that they've had around from before Zach Taylor was even the head coach. They've got all these coaches who have been around from Marvin Lewis era and just kind of hung around for maybe too long. So maybe the message was getting stale. They weren't as motivated as maybe a new, younger coach would be. So that for that reason, maybe they brought in some newer assistant coaches. Offensive line and defensive line coach both came from the Patriots, which is kind of concerning because they basically both got fired, and then the Bengals are kind of picking them up after they got let go. Al Golden coming in as defensive coordinator. He was the defensive coordinator for Notre Dame last season, and they went to the national championship, so that's good. But the thing that really concerns me about this move is he was the linebackers coach when they went to the Super Bowl in 2020 and 2021. He was an assistant under Lou Anarumo. And when they let Lou Anarumo go, the idea was, okay, we're going to change it up. Zach Taylor said, we just need to change it up. But then they bring back a guy who had coached there a couple seasons before. So it's not really that much of a change. And if he was so good, why didn't they just promote him before? So it's kind of confusing. And Al Golden, in his introductory press conference, kind of said the quiet part out loud. He was like, yeah, I'll probably be like the cheapest hire in history because he never moved. His family still lives in Cincinnati even after he left to go to Notre Dame. So he doesn't have to like relocate or anything. He already lives in Cincinnati. So that was, it doesn't help the Bengals narrative of they didn't really scour every nook and cranny to find the best defensive coordinator candidate. I know a lot of people were kind of throwing out bigger names like Robert Saleh or Matt Eberflus or Dennis Allen, some of these guys who had previously been head coaches in the NFL, and Bengals fans were thinking that maybe the Bengals would have interest in them, but I don't think that would ever happen, mostly because Zach Taylor doesn't want any threats to him as head coach. Anybody who has previously, Zach Taylor didn't even have coordinator experience before he took over as Bengals head coach. A lot of people, when he got hired, including me, were saying, wow, that's incredible that this guy would be hired as an NFL coach, even though he really doesn't have that much experience. So the last thing Zach Taylor needs is some guy coming in here with NFL head coaching experience. If and when the Bengals get off to another slow start and lose a bunch of games next season, people are going to be calling for Zach Taylor to be fired. And you don't want that, replacement interim head coach just waiting in the wings, nipping at your heels. So Zach Taylor doesn't want anybody challenging him. That's why bring back Al Golden, a nice, guy who's been an assistant, knows how to toe the company line and fall in line under Zach Taylor. So there's no threats to Zach Taylor. That's exactly why he's a great fit, I'm sure. But they also got a linebackers coach from the Saints. And the interesting thing that he noted, the Saints assistant, one of these interviews, they had all these guys going around making the rounds on different podcasts. And they all say, what you want to hear. I mean, they're not dumb. Like, like the defensive coaches are like, oh, we got to tackle and we got to get after the quarterback and got to, do good job in the red zone and all that kind of stuff that you would expect the coach to say. But the coach coming from the Saints, he was talking about how it's going to be an adjustment going from the Saints to the Bengals because the Bengals coaches have to get more involved in the scouting of the players coming out of college and who they're going to draft. And he was talking about how that's the Saints, we got an army of scouts that do all that stuff, but now I'm coming to the Bengals, I'm going to have to get more involved, which is good. But that's one of the things that has always been one of the narratives about the Bengals, and it doesn't seem to change, even though the Bengals have done pretty poorly most recently in like the last 3 or 4 years of drafting. Outside of some of the first 1 or 2 rounds, Bengals haven't seemed to hit on really any of the players that they've drafted with any consistency. Same thing with free agency. The Bengals did a good job that year they went to the Super Bowl, but then since then, they have had a lot of swings and misses. And it's not like they haven't spent money, they haven't signed anybody. Like, they tried in theory. It's just that the people that they drafted and the people that they signed didn't turn out to be very good. I'm looking at people like Trent Brown, who was the 10-year veteran offensive lineman, brought him in to be that safe option because Amarius Mims was a green rookie. And then Trent Brown, admittedly, game 1 had his worst game he's ever had in his career. So stuff like that was not good for the Bengals. Now, they did have, the only bright spot was really Mike Gesicki in terms of free agents this offseason. It's going to be a challenge to keep Mike Gesicki and most of the players who were good on the Bengals. A lot of teams are sniffing around the Bengals because the free agency class this year is pretty weak. Most teams keep their good players under contract, don't let them even get to free agency. So if the Bengals, I don't think the Bengals will let T. Higgins get to free agency either. I think the most likely outcome would be at least another franchise tag for T. Higgins. That would be the second franchise tag in a row, but it's, put in air quotes, only $26 million for one season. I think if T. Higgins got out onto the open market, he would get a contract of at least probably $30 million a year for multiple seasons, and a lot of it guaranteed. So if the Bengals only have to pay $26 million as kind of another rental deal, I feel like that's probably the direction the Bengals are headed, because if they do that, the Bengals, they'll at least have control of T. Higgins during the offseason. What they don't want, if they don't apply the franchise tag, then T. Higgins would be free to talk with any team in the league, work out any kind of deal he wanted to sign, because he's a free agent. He hasn't signed anything with the Bengals, and he can talk to whoever he wants. And if somebody's offering a much better deal than what the Bengals are offering, because the Bengals are notorious for lowballing their players or people that they're offering in free agency. I know Joe Thuney, who went to the Kansas City Chiefs, and people were saying that he, because he's maybe from the Cincinnati area, would want to come back. But he even said that the Bengals offer wasn't really competitive. And that's what a lot of people have said, like Andrew Whitworth. They didn't really offer him a competitive deal. DJ Reader didn't offer him a competitive deal or really much of anything in the offseason. So the Bengals just kind of let these guys walk out the door, didn't offer them the deal that would compete with the other teams in the NFL, and they let these players go without getting much back in the way of compensation. And so that's what we hope we don't see with T. Higgins. So hopefully at least they franchise tag him, so that would create a situation if the other team wanted T, they would have to trade with the Bengals, and they would get, at least a couple first-round draft picks maybe, or whatever the Bengals could get, but something besides just letting T. Higgins walk out the door. That's the worst-case scenario. But all the players up and down media row, like Joe Burrow has come out and said, the thing that was funny about what Joe Burrow said was the way he phrased it. He said, you don't want to make a living letting all your best players walk out the door. But making a living is exactly what Mike Brown and this Bengals organization have been doing, because by not paying their best players and letting them go, that's just more money that they get to keep. And don't let it fool you. Even though, people say, oh, what a waste of a season. They wasted Joe Burrow's best season of his career. What a letdown. We don't get to see the accounting, the books, and I'm sure the Bengals are raking in tons and tons of profits off of this past season, because the Bengals had sellout crowds for every game, including preseason. Like, even the preseason games were almost completely sold out. I'm sure this run of wins at the end of the season kept fans coming, kept people buying merchandise, buying stuff, paying money to the Bengals. So on top of all the TV deals, the sponsorship deals, all that kind of stuff, the Bengals organization, I'm sure, was incredibly successful off of the field. And that's one of the things that Bengals fans don't want to hear about. But Carson Palmer in 2019 pointed out one of the reasons why he left and got fed up with the team was the team prioritized making money, prioritized the financial aspect over winning football games. And I felt like that was my biggest criticism of the Bengals last season, by the fact that they didn't sign Jamar Chase to a long-term contract extension before the season started. He had that whole hold in throughout training camp. To me, that said, we're not prioritizing winning football games. We're prioritizing saving money. And the Bengals said, we want to sign Jamar Chase to a long-term extension, but it has to be the right terms. It has to be the right amount, blah, blah, blah. That was all just an excuse to say, we just want to push this back another year. And if we don't have to pay any more money this year, great. And so to me, that just said, we don't really care about winning. Not to say that paying Jamar Chase would necessarily guarantee more wins on the football field and better performance on the football field. That's not always the case. We saw players sometimes get paid and then take a step backwards. I mean, look at Geno Stone, the free safety that the Bengals signed to a 2-year contract this season. He might get released. He played so bad on that contract. So there's no guarantee that shelling out a bunch of money, like players like Sheldon Rankins, who is supposedly going to be replacing DJ Reader, they got next to nothing out of all that money that they gave him. So I get it from both sides. But if you want to say that you're really trying to do everything possible to win a Super Bowl, win the AFC North, all that stuff, you would take care of especially your best player. And Jamar Chase went out and people say, oh, he made himself a bunch of money. I don't know how much more money he could really make. I mean, he didn't lose any money for sure, but winning the Triple Crown, leading the NFL in every statistical category pretty much as a receiver, he showed that he's worthy of being the top paid receiver. And the Bengals are going to do that, but on their own terms, very slowly, begrudgingly, and they're never going to let Jamar Chase get to the open market and really have an opportunity to earn as much money as he could. The Bengals are going to try to pay him as little as possible, which is unfortunate, but that's just kind of how this whole system operates. But all this kind of talk is just kind of what's hanging over the Bengals organization, kind of this cloud hanging over them, because it's always this talk about why aren't the Bengals paying their players? We got Joe Burrow got his contract, And now he's doing the right thing and supporting all of his other guys, saying he wants T. Higgins back. He wants Jamar Chase and Trey Hendrickson and even Mike Gesicki to come back in the offseason. He didn't say anything about a lot of those guys on defense, but the offense was good. So bring all those guys back. But obviously Joe Burrow is going to say that, but he doesn't really know. And it's not up to him as the other thing. Like, he can say, oh, we want to sign this guy and we want to sign this guy, but he's not making the decisions. It's Mike Brown, it's Katie Blackburn, Troy Blackburn, Duke Tobin. It's definitely not Zach Taylor, but the thing that's funny is Zach Taylor is kind of the spokesperson by default for the Bengals because Duke Tobin and Mike Brown and all those other people in the front office kind of hide and never really make any public appearances, don't say too much. Now, we did see Duke Tobin at the Senior Bowl giving some interviews to Kelsey Conway of The Inquirer, and all the way up and down the line, it was the same thing he's been saying pretty much of like, well, we want that guy to come back, but we'll have to see if we can make it work. And, so same thing about T. Higgins. Oh, T's a great player. And he was very adamant a couple years ago about, find your own receiver. We got T. Higgins, he's ours. But then when it comes to actually paying T. Higgins a long-term contract extension, they're not so high on that idea. So he said this, we'll see about Trey Hendrickson. And the thing about Trey Hendrickson was, he was like, oh, Trey Hendrickson, he's earned a raise. He definitely deserves it. But can we make it work? And are the terms going to be right for everybody? So obviously, that's going to be a situation of Trey Hendrickson wants a long-term guaranteed contract. He's 30 years old. Bengals don't want to give long-term guaranteed contracts to guys who are 30 years old, despite the fact that Trey Hendrickson has, he led the league in sacks. You could say, if you look at the film, Trey Hendrickson is kind of taking advantage of some weaker competition in some of these games where he's racking up the statistics, and he's not necessarily, as athletic as some of the other guys in the NFL, as dominant at times. There was a game against the Eagles where former Bengal Fred Johnson pretty much shut down Trey Hendrickson all game. So there's moments where Trey Hendrickson can disappear. But, the Bengals, if without him, though, who do the Bengals have on defense? Like, I can't even think of one player on the Bengals defense besides Trey Hendrickson who would be a starter on another NFL team. Like, if you think about it, all the way up and down the roster, I don't know about, like, most of those guys. Like, Logan Wilson, he got injured, so he wasn't playing that well to begin with. But, Dax Hill, he was actually playing pretty well at cornerback until he got hurt. But some of those other guys are like, I don't even know if they would, make it on the other team. So that is going to be one of the interesting things to watch. And if and when do they get Jamar Chase signed to an extension? They already went through this once, and Jamar Chase showed last year that he's willing to sit out all of preseason, mandatory minicamp, whatever it is. Jamar Chase is not going to be there without a contract. I guarantee that. He already went into game one last year not sure whether or not he was going to play. So this year, for sure, if he doesn't get a contract, he is not playing, I don't know how many games, but he's going to sit out games for sure if they don't get this figured out. It's been too long. Bengals have been messing around with Jamar Chase. He needs to get paid. And it's a tough position for the Bengals to be in. But on the other hand, salary cap is going to go up again this year for sure. They're going to have the money to spend. It's just going to be, it always comes down to divvying up those pieces of the pie and et cetera, et cetera. So whatever the Bengals need to do to get their top players signed, they need to do it, because I don't have a lot of confidence that the Bengals are going to be able to replace them with anybody from free agency or in the draft. Like I said, last year they had 10 draft picks. They, for whatever reason, didn't trade up once. And out of all those draft picks, I wouldn't say any 10 of them were an especially great home run, franchise changing pick. They got all these lottery tickets built up. And Eric All, the tight end in the fourth round, he was looking good until he tore his ACL. And that's the same one he tore in college the year before. So now he's going to miss the entire 2025 season, unfortunately, with multiple knee surgeries. Like I said, Amarius Mims was pretty good, but he was their first round pick. Had some ups and downs throughout the season. Chris Jenkins, McKinley Jackson, Jermaine Burton, no. I mean, God, let's just talk about Jermaine Burton for right now. Okay, I think I mentioned this earlier. So against the Steelers, he didn't travel with the team. So we know Jermaine Burton, third-round receiver with first-round talent, but there's questions about his character, you would say, his dedication. There was the game, I think it was against the Raiders this season. It was supposed to be his week. They talked all week about, Jermaine Burton, this and that. He's going to be in part of the game plan. And then actually he's not going to play at all because he missed a bunch of meetings, didn't even show up or call or give any reason for not being there. And then we saw him at the casino. And TJ Houshmandzadeh was the guy who trained him coming up into the draft, announced him as the draft pick. He's like, this is my guy. I saw him on one of I think it was Bengal Jim's podcast. He was on there and they asked him, what's up with your boy? And he was like, man, I tried to talk to him, but I told him you're making me look bad. But he was like, yeah, I mean, Jermaine's not going out to the clubs because I asked him around, but he might be at the casino though. So even TJ was admitting that he was, at the casino. I don't know why. It's not illegal to be at the casino, but anyway, that's not the point. Jermaine Burton, he didn't end up going to the Steelers game. Zach Taylor just says, no comment. Oh, no comment. Coach's decision is all he said. When we found out, he actually got evicted from his apartment for not paying, but also for causing some kind of damage. We found out later they were suing him for back rent and also $10,000 worth of damage. So who knows if he was having parties in the apartment or what was going on. But then also there was a police report of a 911 call. A female victim said she had been romantically involved with Jermaine, but then he got physically aggressive with her, broke her phone, choked her or something, and a bad situation. I don't think any charges were filed, but obviously not a good look for Jermaine Burton. And then, to make matters worse, second time in 2 months, Jermaine Burton gets evicted from another apartment. This time, apparently, the landlord had found out that he had a bunch of dogs in his apartment, and, Jermaine apparently is using the old excuse of, my cousin from out of town brought their dogs and I wasn't there and whatever. He is evicted twice now. And the Bengals have said, we're going to do everything we can to get Jermaine Burton the help that he needs, and we're going to support him and this and that and make sure he gets on the right track. Well, this is the second time in 2 months that the guy has been evicted from an apartment. Obviously, he needs some kind of life skills, and I'm not sure that the Bengals are really assisting him with that. Not that that's all on the Bengals to help him be an adult. I mean, you got to, grow up sometime. But they knew when he was coming in what kind of a person he was, or they should have known. They should have done their homework. And if they didn't, shame on them. But I don't know how the Bengals are going to be able to go through, this whole offseason and go into next season with a straight face talking about, Jermaine Burton is going to be the guy we're going to rely on and count on as a player to contribute on the team next year. Like, you can't even count on this guy to keep a permanent resident. So we may be looking at a high draft pick of receiver for the Bengals, but that's just, more leverage for T. Higgins and Jamar Chase, because the Bengals tried to replace T. Higgins in one way or another through the draft. They've drafted multiple receivers. They've drafted Charlie Jones. Not that necessarily he was going to play the same role as T. Higgins. He was hopefully going to be the Tyler Boyd type of slot receiver replacement, but he didn't really turn into anything. I don't know. I guess Charlie Jones is probably going to make the team next year, but he hasn't done much of anything. Andre Iosivas is kind of that bigger receiver, but he's obviously not in the same caliber of player as T. Higgins, so there's really no threat of Andre Iosivas stepping up. In theory, Jermaine Burton, if he had stepped up and outplayed his third-round draft pick pedigree, you could say that would be a pressure on T. Higgins, but really T. Higgins has all the leverage in this situation. There's tons of teams around the league eyeing T. Higgins. They're just licking their chops, waiting for him to hit the open market so they can offer him tons of money. And I don't want to hear any of this about, oh, well, T. Higgins doesn't play every game. He misses games. He gets injured. Like, so what? When he is on the field, which is the majority of the games, he is one of the best players on the field. Joe Burrow, that's his guy. He's Jamar Chase is Joe Burrow's guy, but T. Higgins is just as much his guy. And when he's out on the field, those two have chemistry. So you don't want to break up that chemistry that they've built for the last 5 seasons. They came into the draft number 1 and 2 for the Bengals in that draft class. And that would just be ridiculous to break that up. So I don't think Joe Burrow wants that. Nobody wants that. T. Higgins probably doesn't want that, but he wants to get paid at the same time, and he doesn't want to feel insulted by something that the Bengals offer him if it's too low. So we don't know what's going on, but that's something to watch, obviously, in the offseason. But speaking of things to watch, NFL playoffs, the first couple rounds of the playoffs weren't really that good, honestly. In the AFC side, we saw the Bills blow away the Broncos. The Steelers got beat down by the Ravens. Wasn't really a close game. So both those teams that the Bengals beat at the end of the season, the Steelers and the Broncos, lost immediately. So that kind of didn't speak that well of the Bengals' chances in the playoffs. I know after the fact, it's such a popular take now. You see all these people say, oh, well, the Bengals didn't make it to the playoffs, but if they did, I bet they would have gone a long way. It's so easy for people to say, oh, well, the Bengals just missed it, and if they had, they probably wouldn't have won the Super Bowl. Yeah, right. But anyway, Texans beat the Chargers. That was a bit of an upset. That was the big thing coming out of that game. Well, that was the revenge of C.J. Stroud on all of his doubters, and also Justin Herbert having like 4 interceptions in that game. Didn't look good at all. Ladd McConkey had a couple of nice plays in that game, but Chargers kind of blew up in that one. Then going over to the NFC side, we saw the Rams dismantle the Vikings. Sam Darnold didn't look good. I won't say the G word, but everybody was saying the same thing after that game. Sam Darnold, he was just standing back there getting sacked, not throwing the ball. Or when he did throw it, he was just way off. So weird game out of Sam Darnold. Vikings out early. And that was 2 bad games in a row because Lions had beaten the Vikings to take the number 1 seed the week before that. Another bad game by Sam Darnold. Then Commanders won a close game against the Buccaneers in Tampa Bay. That was a game we saw the kicker, Zane Gonzalez, coming on the field. And he was doing like these nervous twitches and stuff. And I didn't know at the time. Apparently, he suffers from OCD, so that's just something that he does every game. But that was kind of a spotlight on mental health, I guess, in that game. Strange you have a kicker with OCD, but what are you going to do? So then the Eagles took care of the Packers. Eagles defense suffocated the Packers, only allowed 10 points in that game. Then in the divisional round, we saw the Chiefs. They took care of the Texans. The big matchup in that round was Bills going up against the Ravens, and Bills actually won the close game. Lamar Jackson had a couple of turnovers in that game. Not his best performance, but it was a good game nonetheless. On the NFC side, the Commanders actually took care of the Detroit Lions. That was a big game from the Commanders. Jared Goff throwing some interceptions, not looking great in that game, getting blown up on the way for a pick 6. So the Commanders made their way to the NFC Championship. It was reminiscent of Joe Burrow, although Jaden Daniels is a rookie. He's a Heisman Trophy winner, quarterback out of LSU. So they said no rookie quarterback has ever gone to a Super Bowl, and that didn't end up happening. But the Eagles beat the Rams, and so that set up a championship matchup of Chiefs, Bills, Eagles, Commanders. Eagles blew away the Commanders. Commanders had like 3 or 4 fumble lost in that game. They just kept fumbling the ball away back to the Eagles, who won 55-23. And the Eagles, Saquon Barkley was going crazy in that game with long touchdown runs. And then in the AFC Championship game, Josh Allen a little inconsistent to start the game. Chiefs ended up winning 32-29. Bills defense just couldn't get a stop at the end of the game. Too many injuries, I think, on the Bills, especially at safety. They just had too many injuries in their secondary, so they weren't able to really cover those Chiefs receivers. So it set up the Super Bowl matchup in New Orleans of Eagles, Chiefs. I think just on one of these shows, Alex Kappa and Ted Karras were making the rounds, and Ted Karras actually said that he thought the Eagles were the only team that they had played this season that had really whooped them good and like were just dominating. And I think that was true. Like the game against the Chiefs was pretty close for the Bengals. You know, they had them 4th and long there until that defensive pass interference penalty by Dejon Anthony. But you would say that up and down the roster, the Eagles had better players overall, but nobody was really counting the Chiefs out because you can't when the Chiefs have won the last 2 Super Bowls in a row and 3 out of the last 4. It's hard to bet against a team like that. But in the end, Eagles just were better on that day. The score was a little bit deceptive. It was 40-22. But if you watch that game, I think at one point it was 34-0 and 40-6. The Chiefs got a couple just garbage time touchdowns when the Eagles had put in their backups just to say that they got to play in the Super Bowl. And then, oh, okay, well, we didn't say go in there and give up a bunch of touchdowns, but still it was too much, too little too late for the Chiefs in that one. Eagles still won handily, and they were the champions. So Jalen Hurts was the MVP kind of by default just because he was the quarterback. Hard to say who was really the MVP of the game, but just the Eagles' defense as a whole was the reason that they won that game. Like everybody says, defense wins championships, and that was especially true for the Eagles this year. All the way, just defensive line, interior, linebackers, safeties, cornerbacks, all over the Eagles' defense. They were just strong, and even their backups were good. So great job by the Eagles in drafting, picking up free agents, converting Zach Bond from a edge rusher into a all-pro middle linebacker. So just great job all the way around by the Eagles this season. And Joe Burrow said, hey, the Eagles are signing all their people. They signed the quarterback, signed their 2 top wide receivers, signed their defensive linemen, seem to be paying everybody, and it's working. So that seems like the way we should go too. But again, it's not up to Joe Burrow. I'm sure it's easy for him to say, let's just pay everybody. But the Bengals will probably say, hey, Joe Burrow, we paid you. You mind your own business. Joe Burrow's got enough going on in his life. He did win the comeback player of the year at the NFL awards. He got up and said, not the type of award you want to be nominated for twice, but he was, grateful to everybody for on the team and yada, yada, yada that he won it. Josh Allen for the Bills actually won MVP. A lot of people thought that was weird that he won over Lamar Jackson, but that's the way it went. Jaden Daniels was Offensive Rookie of the Year. Jared Verse, Defensive Rookie of the Year. Jared Verse, Defensive Edge Player for the Rams. He was the player taken immediately after Amarius Mims was taken. So it's kind of like if you could go back and do it all again, I think given how bad the Bengals were on the defensive edge, not getting any pressure, maybe that would have been a better pick, but we'll see. In the long term, we'll have to still wait and see how it all looks out. But that is a wrap on this season. Like I said, I did get a little bit of feedback, especially for the game going into this last game of the season where the Steelers. I admit I was overly negative in one of those preview episodes. I was too negative even for me. And that's the difference between what do I want to say versus what do the listeners want to hear. So I got to be more cognizant of that, I know. But I was just so sick of hearing. This is the thing is I was like reacting to what I was hearing on other shows, which I can't do. I should just not listen to other shows and not try to be like counter-programming what everybody else is saying. But I was hearing, oh, the Bengals still have a chance. They're still going to make it to the playoffs, and then you never know. And I just heard that everywhere, and I heard that for like 5 weeks in a row. Couldn't take it anymore, and I just had to be glass half empty on that episode. So I apologize. I try to keep it positive most of the time, but sometimes I just couldn't take it anymore. But like I said, it's hard to be positive when the Bengals have missed on so many opportunities. And I forgot to mention one thing. Jermaine Pratt, not that this is like a major news story, but Jermaine Pratt has requested a trade. He was the middle linebacker for the Bengals last season. He's been on the team since 2019, since Zach Taylor got there. So it's probably a situation where the Bengals are going to let him go anyway. So he might just be trying to get some interest drummed up from other teams. Like, hey, come sign me because I'm about to be a free agent. So maybe they can get a trade for Jermaine Pratt. We'll see. But another player named Jermaine might be on the way out. But I do appreciate the feedback. One person said, hey, I didn't come here to hear a bunch of objective, balanced, maybe even negative takes about the Bengals. I want to hear some positivity. And I understand that. I get that perspective. But like I said, I can't be positive all the time. Sometimes you need some balance, some objectivity. And that, on the one hand, I should take that as a compliment because it's pretty much what I'm going for. I'm trying to be balanced. I'm trying to be objective. I'm trying to be factually accurate and not just give a homer take. But I need to realize that might not be what people want to hear. So walking a fine line there of, do I want to be liked and accepted by the most amount of people, or do I want to be correct and have some kind of a balanced, objective, reasonable take? Not everybody's going to appreciate that, but maybe there are some fans out there who are like me, want to hear that kind of an opinion. I'm just a regular everyday fan. These are just my 2 cents. You can take it or leave it. But hopefully, you'll feel like, oh man, there's somebody out there that maybe feels like you do, and I'm not crazy. Okay, maybe I am crazy. I don't know. You let me know. But what's next? We got the combine, free agency. Who's going to get franchise tag? Will T. Higgins get franchise tag? Will the Bengals work out contract extensions with some of these players before they get away? Stay tuned. But we'll be back before you know it. So until next time, thank you for listening all the way. And I'm going to leave you with a hooday and stay hungry for more Bengal Bites.